Dialoguing on South Asia, we explore the lives of its people, hear their stories and the histories of the land, discover its beauty, and encounter its conflicts, complexities, and harmonies in a search for liberty, peace, and prosperity. Interacting with leaders, activists, academics, and common folk from the South Asian sphere about their work and their passions, their dreams and their life journeys, their immigrant experiences, advocacy efforts, religion, politics, and so much more with this, your host, journalist and author Peter Friedrich. Hand in hand, we meet and stand with South Asia. This is DOSA. Welcome to the show, Mr. Raju Rajagopal, and good morning to you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to some dialogue with you, seeing where the conversation unfolds. And I hope it's about 11 a.m. where you're at right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 11:03. Yeah,
11:03. I'm here. It's about 2 p.m. where I'm at, and I'm actually deep into probably my second or my third cup of coffee. I don't know about you. Are you a coffee guy or a chai guy?
well, I've already finished with my third cup of coffee, but
Okay.
with oat milk, with
I,
very little.
I tend to be a
espresso.
little bit of a chai and a coffee guy. I start the morning with chai, and then but my morning doesn't actually really get going until I get onto the coffee.
So how are you doing after your 10-day fast, and have you recovered fully back to the way you were?
I am doing well. Thanks for asking. Although I have to offer a slight correction. It was 9 days, not 10 days. Maybe next
Okay.
time I'll go 10. I'm doing all right. I'm starting to feel back to my normal self. Still working on getting the pounds packed back on, getting back up to speed with full eating. Took me a while to get back into the routine. And some of my loved ones commented to me that they heard that for skinny guys, it's actually easier not to eat than it is to eat. So now the real struggle, the real battle ahead is to actually put those meals in front of me and then get that energy in me so I can put myself to work.
Right.
So, what's your deal, Raju? You live in California, but you're not originally from California, as I understand. And you're a co-founder of this organization called Hindus for Human Rights, but that's a more recent endeavor of yours. You've done a lot of things before that. What's your deal, Raju?
Yeah, I've been involved in human rights issues and rural development issues in India for the last 30 years. And right at the beginning of that career, I was personally exposed to what happened in Gujarat under Chief Minister Modi's rule, and that deeply affected me as a person who loves democracy, loves India. So I think I should say that maybe that was the beginning of my activism on the human rights front. And
I was back in
as I've
2002.
seen back in 2002, yes,
Yes, sir.
I traveled extensively in Gujarat at that time, actually to turn the clock back a year, 2001. Was just the beginning of my activism after I had retired from corporate life. And while we were in India, the
Well,
earthquake struck.
can I actually to not interrupt you, but to interrupt you, can I put a little bit of a pin in that and trace back
Yeah,
just before?
yeah.
So you had just recently 2001, 2002, before all this happened, that got you involved in human rights work. You'd retired or were near retirement from a career as a healthcare professional. And as I asked, you came to the U.S. You're not in California, but you came to the U.S. from India, didn't you? You were born in India.
Yes, I was born in India in 1947, just a few weeks after India's independence. So in some ways, the country of India and I are siblings, very close siblings.
You're a
Uh,
child of India's independence.
I came to this country in 1969, 68 actually, September 68. Initially to
yeah,
Canada and then to the US.
okay, to Canada initially. What brought you to North America?
Uh, what at that time, trying to get my advanced degree, master's. Very few of us at that time actually contemplated staying back in the US seeking jobs. We were all coming here at that time to get advanced degrees, and that was my intent too when I came to the US. Of course, things changed rapidly after that.
So after you came to the U.S. and you came, many people who are seeking this better life, you came for your educational purposes. You got into this career in healthcare, and as you were in this career in healthcare, was there anything in your life during this time that preceded or connected to what you're doing now? Was there any kind of a connection between this involvement in the healthcare industry and your passion for what you do today?
Not really. I don't think my profession had much to do with what I'm doing now. But it's almost as if some of my childhood ideas about India and about various social issues had stayed with me, and I had kind of deferred them for a few decades. So as soon as I retired, I was very quick to get back into what I knew was my calling, which is to work on human rights. So it didn't have anything to do with the career, as other than the fact that I think the career gave me the freedom, I suppose, the financial freedom to actually engage full time in human rights work.
Well, that's certainly at least one of the things one could desire to get from a career is to finance or give you the financial freedom to go after whatever your true passion really is, whatever's really in your heart. What was that that was in your childhood upbringing? Those ideas that you mentioned about these ideas from your childhood in India that really stuck with you. I mean, you must have been what, 20, 25 when you came to North America?
Yeah, younger than that, 20, yeah, some about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I think things that stick out in my mind about my childhood education are two things. Uh, One, I was schooled in the local language Kannada in Bangalore, and I
So
went to
you grew up in Karnataka.
Karnataka, yeah, in Bangalore,
Okay.
and I went to a school that was very Gandhian. We had just gotten independence just 10, 15 years before that. And this school was entirely set up on admiration for Gandhi and Nehru. And so that was the environment of the school. But more importantly, we were also exposed to some of the progressive Hindu thought. Of people like 12th century Saint Basavanna, who actually fought even as long ago as 12th century, had fought against the caste system and rejected Vedic Hinduism and wrote a series of poems for the common man. And he also had organized at that time a debating society, if you will, debating society where people from all castes were welcome. Very unusual for such a long time ago. And for that, he was harassed, intimidated by the local rulers, and his disciples were supposedly trampled by elephants as punishment. So that really stuck in my mind, the entire idea of a caste system and the fact that somebody like Baswana had fought against it. So that's one
Well,
side of the story.
and that's very vivid imagery also, especially as a young
Yeah,
man, young boy, to have stuck in your head is this idea of this progressive activist working for civil rights and his followers being trampled by elephants simply for standing up for human rights.
yeah,
So that
absolutely.
stuck in your mind.
Yeah, that's one side of the story. The other side is I was exposed in parallel to my childhood friends and neighbors who were staunch Hindu Mahasabha members and people of
And just for the record, for those who may not already be in the know, the Hindu Mahasabha was founded, what I believe, early 1900s, as one of the initial Hindu nationalist movements in India.
right. Hindu Mahasabha is the predecessor to the today's RSS, Rashtriya Swayansemak Sangh, and its founder Savarkar wrote a lengthy essay called Hindutva, which has become kind of a Bible, so to speak, for the RSS people. And it's also one of his Hindu Mahasabha members who was involved in assassinating Mahatma Gandhi. So that's the background. So these people of my age and my classmates actually were heavily involved in the RSS and RSS shakas.
Hmm.
And in fact, for a short period of time, I too was in an RSS shaka in Bangalore.
Well, this is actually
Uh,
the first I've heard of this, Raju. At your young age, you were involved in an RSS Shaka, or Shaka is the word
in
for a
RSS
branch of the
shaka
RSS.
for a brief period, no doubt, because my friends had pressured us to join all three brothers.
Okay.
But as it happened, I moved away from that neighborhood, and when I joined a new school, I was exposed to the Boy Scouts of America, Boy Scouts basically of India, which gave me a very different compare and contrast. The fanaticism, belief in myths that my friends from the RSS happen to believe in, and that contrast also helped me kind of ground myself in the idea of universalism in respecting all religions and so forth. So in a strange way, in a Gandhian school, exposed to neighbors who are RSS and joining the Boy Scouts in that Gandhian school, all kind of came together to kind of form this imagery in my mind about what should be about, what India is about: pluralism, secularism, respect for all religions. And that foundation of RSS stayed with me because we had a lot of arguments with this classmate of ours. And to me, it was very clear. This was the late 50s, the fanaticism of the RSS, which to this day, their arguments are very, very similar to what I heard from my young friend that long ago. So that was kind of so this is what I meant by this is all in my mind, but I had to defer any action or activity on that through my formative, career and marriage and family. And
But,
then
and
when
of
I got
course, through an immigration journey,
yeah,
which is
immigration.
one of the hardest things that anybody in this world can go through, as far as a upheaval in your personal life and getting reestablished in a new country, new culture, and certainly a major challenge in and of its own.
And in addition to being directly exposed to racism in this country, which I did in Detroit. Yeah. So all of that
Especially
happened.
coming over into this country in what the 60s,
It
70s.
was 69, 70s when I was there in Detroit and in Windsor, Canada, where I felt very, very uh, discriminated against because of the color of my skin. So that also stayed with me. But anyway, as I said, uh, the time to act upon all of these beliefs came in 2002
So
when
yeah,
I started.
I can imagine, especially coming over at that time, even in Canada, especially perhaps more so in the U.S., that one coming as an Indian, trying to become an Indian American, would feel particularly isolated. We didn't have that kind of like thriving Indian American diaspora presence and culture and pockets that we have today, where you really have a chance to come over and fit in and be made to be felt, made to feel at home. Um,
Yeah,
and then, of course, although we certainly have a host of problems today that still need to be dealt with from the perspective of racism in America, issues of especially of white supremacy, of course. Thank God, and I can only imagine and attempt to empathize, but thank God, at least today, like I hope that the situation for people that are coming over from India or anywhere else and trying to make a better life for themselves here in this country and become part of our country, find it an easier path in general than it was way back
yeah,
then.
yeah. Yeah, sometimes I reflect on that, Peter, and I said, we had to fend for ourselves as first generation immigrants. We had to face racism. We went ahead, we went on, made a career. I sometimes wonder if the current generation of immigrants from India uh, the path is very easy, but I also sometimes wonder whether the day after they land here, they expect everything to work out for them and all kinds of rights to be guaranteed to them, without realizing that the first generations have had paved the way for them to come here, as well as the civil rights movement. And to come here the very next day and start talking about Hindu phobia sometimes annoys me, but that's the way it is.
Well, so then, of course, in context of this chatter about Hindu phobia, which I know you're oftentimes, despite being a Hindu, despite being a leader in this Hindus for Human Rights organization, you oftentimes face this allegation yourself. I know, and hopefully we can touch on that a little bit to come, but I know that certainly must feel deeply uncomfortable. But let's talk a little bit about, as you mentioned, even before this 2002, already in 2001, you were starting to get involved or pay more attention to what was going on over in India in regards to human rights and I guess the Hindu nationalist movement. Why was that? And what drew your attention there?
Actually, what brought me to Hindu nationalism was the earthquake in Gujarat in 2001.
Hmm.
Since we happened to be in India, I was actively pursuing relief and rehabilitation for victims of Gujarat, and came away with a lot of admiration for the civil society in Gujarat at that time. And exactly a year later, well, maybe slightly longer than a year, 2002, when I went back following the large-scale pogroms against Muslims, I was amazed at the contrast. The same people who had come with all of their heart to help victims of the earthquake seemed to be now thirsting for vengeance and blood and so forth with the pogroms against Muslims. So that contrast made me aware there's a huge, deep-seated prejudice against Muslim minorities and Christian minorities that had shown its face in Gujarat. And I knew that this would not be confined to Gujarat because it had basically succeeded in bringing past history as though it was happening today. In other words, go back to historical Muslim invasions and destruction of temples and so forth.
Reawaking historical grievances, some of which may be legitimate, but from hundreds of years ago, in order to justify some kind of spirit of vengeance today.
Exactly. And so I knew the potential for that kind of propaganda to spread to the rest of the country. And that's when I decided to get involved actively working on communal harmony projects, in the Muslim dialogue, and those kinds of things. So
that must be because you saw this 2001, then you saw 2002, and you mentioned the same people that were actively working for relief in 2001. Then you saw in 2002, same people involved in this February, March 2002 pogrom against Muslims. That must be a very odd dichotomy. And I mean, as myself, as somebody aware of the workings of the Hindu nationalist movement, the structural organization of the Hindu nationalist groups, that is something that we do see a lot. Is we do see many of them do engage in very legitimate and even admirable charity or relief work at the same time that they're pushing this sort of xenophobia or hatred or even violence. So what do you think of that? How do you explain that?
Yeah, first let me kind of correct the way I put it. As far as the significant part of the NGOs that I worked with during the earthquake, they were equally appalled at the pogroms, and they worked on helping the victims. So when I say the same people, I'm talking about in a broad sense the Gujarati civil society.
Yeah, not the majority of people offering relief.
Right.
So you have
Right.
specific segment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, take this 2001 earthquake as an example. We didn't make any distinction as to who was getting aid, where the relief supplies would be channeled, and all of that. It didn't matter whether they're Hindu or Muslim victims. But what we heard is in Kutch, RSS had, or VHP had kind of a blocked off an area as if it was their own territory to provide relief. And any charity, any trucks that came there with supply, they would say, "Okay, we will take it from here," and literally hijack the trucks into their territory. And whoever was Muslim in that area, they would demand that they say Jai Shri Ram before they got their supplies. So here is how you see charity working in parallel with fanatical ideas of forcing Muslims to chant something that they would rather not, and try to exert their superiority. So that kind of a parallelism you see now in the US as well, because there is a lot of charity work, they do good work in COVID and all of that. But it also comes associated with an ideology of hate. So it's a consistent thing, and I think it's very well planned as a larger RSS ideology, seva as a means to changing the hearts and minds of people.
Seva being this idea of service.
Yeah.
And yeah, but yeah, seva being a ideological means of, as you were saying.
Service. Yeah. Yeah. And
But
I think
it's
that's
used
taken.
as this ideological in this specific context by these groups. It's used as an ideological driving force to advance their own causes.
Exactly. Exactly. And unfortunately, in this country, since people don't know the flip side of that ideology, lot of our lawmakers are taken in by all these advances of charity and liaison with the Hindu organizations, Hindu supremacist organizations do during various festivals and those kinds of things. So, yeah. So,
well, as they say, it's amazing how much work you can get done if you don't care who gets the credit. But as I believe you've seen, as I certainly know, I've seen both in India and then here in the U.S. with RSS or linked organizations or the RSS itself. They do a lot of work on the condition that they get the credit from my perspective. So, but let's talk a little bit more. So this was 2002, and then you were already in India in 2001, helping with relief efforts, and then 2002, this pogrom hits in Gujarat, and now the Prime Minister of India, Modi, was at the time the Chief Minister, the head of the state of Gujarat, and he was variously accused of some kind of involvement in or allowing this pogrom. Now, along this way, the pogrom occurred. All of this violence happened. Approximately 1,000, 2,000 Muslims estimated were killed. But you ended up after the fact. You ended up on the ground in Gujarat. Is that correct?
we were there. See, the pogroms were in February, March, and we were there in September. And we, being a group of US-based Indians of all faiths, we went together on a what we called as a Sadbhavana mission, promoting peace, Sadbhavana mission. And we met with the victims, we met with all kinds of NGOs, we met with politicians. Narendra Modi refused to meet with us at that time. We also met in Delhi with the National Human Rights Commission and the politicians, urging them to take, especially the government, the Congress governments, Congress politicians, to take a strong stand against what happened in Gujarat. And unfortunately, their view was, I remember one Congress politician telling a senior Congress politician, telling us, why, in the context of Gujarat and Narendra Modi, why go through a surgery when you can cure the problem with an aspirin? Just think about the import of that. A Congress politician basically saying it's not such a big deal. Let's not do something drastic with Narendra Modi. It's
Sounds
just
like
a minor pain.
treating the symptom instead of the disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is I'm sure this particular gentleman must be thinking about that statement today, and what they could have done to stop this, rush to a Hindu Rashtra under Modi's rule that's happening today.
Why go through a surgery if you treat it with an aspirin instead? Now, if that you were getting that kind of mentality, that sort of response from a senior opposition politician at the time, not they weren't opposition then, they're opposition now, of course, but at the time, as kind of outcome of this trip, how do you feel it went? What do you think was the overall impact of this? Now, whether it was, at the moment, in context of in India, or perhaps even longer term, because as you mentioned, you went there with some people, multi-faith group of Indian Americans. I imagine that probably led to the development of longer term relationships.
Yeah. Well, I would say, as far as impact within India, probably minimal. But as far as the impact in the diaspora of us coming together during that trip and afterwards has remained with us to the extent that today the very same people who were in that trip, some of the same people are at the forefront of the fight against Modi's rule in India, and one of them you're going to speak to on Friday.
Yeah, we'll just name drop him right.
John Prabhudas.
Again, John Prabhudas, who's one of the founders of Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, FIACONA, which again, with respect, and I say this absolutely with respect, is like yourself, Raju, an old timer who's been in this for 20 plus years, who's been faithful in struggling for uplifting human rights and upholding human dignity in India. And that's certainly one of the reasons I want to talk with him. Absolutely why I'm so glad to be chatting with you today.
Yeah. So let me complete my thought on that. The impact would have been, I think, if we had continued with our advocacy. Because after coming back from India, I started an initiative called Promise of India. Promise of India was simply a pledge to support the Indian democracy, secular democracy, and to speak up. And it was endorsed by a whole range of people, including the business community here in the Bay Area and elsewhere, endorsed by two former prime ministers of India, one former president of India. So everybody sensed there was a real danger to Indian constitution. Over 250 organizations signed that. Now, that would have been the pathway we would have been on, except for one thing. 2004 elections, which ejected the BJP Vajpayee government and brought in Manmohan Singh, suddenly made things look a lot rosier to all of us, saying, oh my God, we've already achieved our objective. This fanatical BJP government has been kicked out, and Manmohan Singh is in charge, and given his background, I think that everything will be fine. So we literally stopped in our tracks, not do anything except for the visa ban that we can talk about in a minute. So the impact of that trip that we had was more to do with the fact that a group of us have kept in touch and continue to advocate for peace and pluralism in India. But I don't think it had much of an impact in India itself.
That's one of the amazing things about just putting your hand to the plow and trying to do the right thing and moving forward without looking back as you're attempting to do the right thing and walk that good path, is that sometimes it leads to unintended consequences that you don't foresee. As you mentioned, maybe that particular trip in India, as far as the outcome in India itself, didn't have so much in the moment impact, but it's beautiful to see one of the outcomes is over 20 years later, still having developed in these relationships, which are now flourishing. And just a side note for the listeners, because as I was hearing you speak, Raju, did remind me that a moment ago I referred to your meeting with the senior Congress politician, and I think you said late 2002, as a meeting with the Congress now being in opposition, then being not in opposition. They were actually in opposition at that time because, as you mentioned, Congress didn't actually take power again nationally until 2004. So, as you said, once 2004 hit and Congress did come into power, I can understand that actually, especially for somebody that has so much else to do. For an activist that's been applying themselves for a while, that must have come as a huge breath of relief, and kind of felt like a moment when you can sit back, you can relax, and expect things to go on track. But well, of course, for a while they were a lot calmer, but there was this one hiccup, and actually hiccup that turned into a victory for the anti-Hindu nationalist movements and figures here in America, which was in 2005. Now, in 2005, as I understand it, Modi, then Chief Minister of Gujarat, had been invited by this Indian American hoteliers group to speak at a conference, a convention in Florida. But there was a concerted effort to oppose that. And I understand John Prabhudas was involved in that. I just spoke yesterday with this gentleman, Pastor Ben Marsh, formerly of Dalit Freedom Network, who was involved, although more peripherally involved with that. But from my understanding, Raju, you were kind of a point person and kind of in the inner circle now. What happened? How did you get involved in that? Why? And what was your experience? Was it a walk in the park?
Not exactly a walk in the park. My involvement was with a group of people who were trying to highlight Modi's complicity in the 2002 violence. And his coming to the US was an opportunity to educate the American public about what had happened, because it had been completely forgotten. It wasn't in anybody's consciousness at that time.
America was busy thinking about the wars in the Middle East instead of about how 2,000 Muslims had just been massacred in India.
Yeah. So I was of the opinion, let him come here and let's show our opposition by protests and so forth, that wherever he's speaking, that to me would have been what my preference would be. But then as things developed, as the Hoteliers Association actually acceded to our protest and more or less, I don't know the particulars, more or less disinvited him or disinvited his personal invitation, and I think he ended up still speaking on the phone or remote video conference or something like that. So the momentum at that time was built up with a combination of forces. We didn't know where it was going to end up until one fine day we heard that his visa had indeed been revoked. I think some people give me too much credit for that. They certainly, I don't deserve that credit.
Well, I'm happy right here, right now, to declare that you were the crucial linchpin behind the entire thing. But are you saying you don't want to go with that title?
Let me put it this way: I was involved more in communication, in letter writing campaigns on behalf of the group of people, but I was simply speaking for the group. So in that sense, my name may have been more visible than others. But when the decision, and nobody expected any such decision at all. And so when it came through, it was a bit of a surprise to us. And I still don't know exactly what actually, tipped the balance, but I would assume that all of our efforts together tipped the balance, because the evidence was clear. Reports had come out with all the information. So once that decision was made, I did write a thank you letter to the Bush administration, which kind of went viral in those days. because the person I was speaking to was not exactly my favorite person in the administration, one of the neocons. But I made it a point to
Not
tell him,
exactly your, I'm going to surmise not exactly your favorite person and what might not have exactly been your favorite administration.
yeah. Uh, Yeah. But I did make it a point to say I disagree with a lot of your foreign policy decisions, but in this one instance, I agree with you for doing this because it is the only option that was left to us because the Indian media had moved away from the program. There had been silence. One or two corporate business leaders who had spoken up had been silenced, and there was nothing going on, and the Congress government basically actually was not going to do anything to follow up in what happened in Gujarat. In fact, Manmohan Singh, after the visa ban, actually protested, which is, I guess, he is the prime minister of the country. He is supposed to do that protocol or whatever. He actually objected to the US denying Modi a visa. So our point of view then is, as US citizens and residents who wanted to do something about highlighting the danger to democracy in India, we have very few options. We don't vote in India. And here we are voting for a government that's supposed to safeguard democracy all across the world, presumably. Therefore, to us, the only option left was to highlight the fact that Modi was complicit in this massive violence, and the visa ban was therefore welcomed by all of us. It's a different matter if he wore it as a badge of honor and went about boasting. Some people fault us for this whole episode, saying you guys helped put Modi in power. I think that's highly exaggerated. I don't think.
Yeah.
The ban was the yeah. Um, I'm sorry about the noise outside here. Yeah.
That's a interesting point. And before we move on to getting a little bit closer to the present day, I have heard this argument recently. I don't know which side I settle on. Certainly, I would argue from my perspective that the right thing to do in 2005 was to get Modi's visa stripped away from him, and it was. But I have also heard people purport that maybe it ended up 20 years later or 17 years later backfiring in terms of actually helping to popularize him and build him up among his Hindu nationalist supporters and devotees, both in India and the US. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, we had to do what we thought was the right thing at that time, support the right policies, and things could have things could have gone completely the other way if the Manmohan Singh government had recognized the danger of what had happened in Gujarat. And as soon as they came to power, if they had implemented certain actions that would prevent this from happening elsewhere. For example, banning the Bajrang Dal. I'm just picking one example. And they failed to do that. It's almost like they completely try to erase what happened in Gujarat from their consciousness. Part of it could well be that even some Congress party people were involved in the violence. I don't know. But so to say that the Modi visa ban was the wrong thing to do because it actually elevated him as a martyr of sorts, I don't. It may have had some role, but I don't think too much about it. We did what we thought was right at that point, and things could have gone the other way had there been much more action by the ruling government.
Maybe a little bit, or a little bit less action too, as in if the Manmohan Singh government hadn't criticized the denial, but had just either been
exactly. Yeah, right.
Right. So that was 2005. Now over the ensuing 9 years, Modi came to power, of course, in 2014. Were you mostly out of the activist game up until then? And I mean, at some point, I would hope that you've had a chance to at least attempt to enjoy your retirement. So
Yes,
in those 9 years, was there
yeah,
anything like that, or?
that was my intent, and I did. We did spend some time overseas doing other things, but I also got involved in the Aadhaar project in India because I thought I needed to do something that was potentially could help millions of poorer people in India who had no access to social safety network because of lack of identification. And the other project promised an identification paper to everybody. So I got involved in that. So I was actually a volunteer for the government of India for about a year. And in fact, the name Adar was actually suggested by me. So for good or bad, my name is stuck with that project. Um, but today, in retrospect, of course, I don't want to sidetrack, but today I have a very different view of what an identity project with a huge database with people's fingerprints and uh, uh, could do in the hands of a government that simply doesn't care for any privacy or any laws or rules. And of course, I had no way of imagining that in these years, the government would transition to autocratic government like we have seen. But anyway, so I did that as part of my contribution to India. And then pretty much retired until 2019. See, in 2014, when Modi got elected, that it wasn't enough for me to give up my retired life and come back to activism because I always hoped that all the divisiveness during the campaigns were BJP's way of getting to power. And once they acquired power, that they would focus on uh, bread and butter issues, employment issues. Uh, People called me naive then, and I guess I was. Uh,
Well, I mean, back when the BJP first came to national power in '98, it wasn't. One could argue one way or the other, but arguably the rhetoric that they used may not have been quite as inflammatory to come to power. It was the same type of rhetoric, the same chatter, the same supremacist type of talk, wasn't it? And then we had '98 to 2004 with the BJP in power, and they didn't do anything like what the government of the BJP in 2014 onwards ended up doing.
yeah,
So I could that may have been an understandable sentiment at the time.
yeah. So when 2019 elections happened, that's when it was a wake-up call to me saying, no, these guys have too many IOUs to the Hindu supremacist groups, RSS and others, and VHP, and there is no way this government can get away from quote unquote fulfilling those promises. And the moment I heard that Amit Shah was going to be the home minister, to me, the writing was on the wall. This is it. This is what they've been waiting for over 90 years. This will be the fulfillment of various promises.
What was it about Amit Shah in particular that caused you to see the writing on the wall?
Um, because from what I had heard, this is all third-hand information, though, what I had heard of his role uh, in working with Modi in Gujarat, people had a certain reputation for him as a ruthless politician, and this whole issue of attempted assassination of Modi and then encounter killings of people that were involved. A lot of them, those kinds of things, people kind of, you know, kind of look to Amit Shah as perhaps the architect of the Modi plan in many ways. So I think it's the reputation. I had no direct evidence of any kind, but just the reputation he brought from Gujarat was the writing was on the wall, and
Okay.
so that's when we decided to start Hindus for Human Rights because I think I finally came to the realization that all these 20, 30 years that I'd been working for Indian causes were, I never had to wear my faith on my shoulder. It was always, I'm Indian American, this is what I believe in, this is what I need to do. Never had to say I'm a Hindu or I'm a proud Hindu. But in retrospect, it seemed to me that people like me who wanted to do something and didn't claim a Hindu voice, in fact, were leaving a huge vacuum for the Hindutva people to occupy.
Were you were you particularly religious before then?
I wouldn't say I would call myself particularly religious because, as I said, when I influenced by people like Baswana and others and rejecting the rituals, I always thought of myself as a progressive Hindu, looking to the good aspects of Hinduism and rejecting aspects like caste and so forth. Was I a observing Hindu? Did I do puja every day? No. But I always loved visiting temples, learning the history, trying to make connections, and trying to look at history in a positive sense to think of what progressive Hinduism means. Yes, so I'm a practicing Hindu because I'm not practicing any other faith. So by default, I'm a practicing Hindu, but I'm not an Orthodox Hindu. To answer your question.
So by the time of 2019, though, you felt this compulsion that as this is happening over in India, as this, especially this idea of being a proud Hindu is turning into this idea of the distortion of the faith that you practice, that you own. You felt a compulsion that you had to step forward and say something.
Yeah. So that's when I accidentally got in touch with Sunita, who had kind of traveled the same path in many ways, and we seem to have so much in common in terms of we need to speak up with a Hindu voice. That's when we made the decision to found Hindus for Human Rights. Uh, the human rights part is exactly what everybody is striving for, whether it's Amnesty International or any other group. But the Hindu part that makes us different, saying we will, as much as possible, speak as Hindus to a Hindu audience to say, hey, is this what you learned? Is this what the Hinduism that you believed in and your grandparents taught you? Is lynching part of that? Is dictating what other people can eat? Was that part of your Hinduism? uh, to raise these kinds of questions. Is marrying somebody outside the faith, is that part of Hinduism? For us to be able to raise those questions legitimately, we need to speak as Hindus. And so that's what we decided to do in 2019. Uh, at that time, a lot of people were skeptical, especially people from the left would challenge them. Why do you want Hindu in your name? Why don't you just call yourself Hindus for Human Rights, or Indians for Human Rights? And our answer would be, well, that makes us no different than others who are fighting this fight. What makes us different? And even today, some people have those questions, but uh, I feel very strongly there was a right decision to speak up as Hindus because we have now been able to reclaim a lot of spaces that was hitherto completely occupied by Hindu nationalists, uh, particularly in the US, whether it's interfaith groups. We are participating in the World Parliament of Religions in a major way, which is now talking about today, tomorrow, day after.
Which is happening in Chicago this week.
In Chicago, titled as Human Rights. What is the faith leader's role in human rights? Which is exactly what our topic is about. And all of this would not have been possible if we had simply been just another human rights organization. And then our welcome in various spaces in DC, our welcome by congressional officers who suddenly now see an alternative Hindu voice to those of, like, for example, Hindus American Foundation. So I think it was the right strategic decision to do, but we are still a minority. Progressive Hindus speaking for the human rights and religious freedom of all communities, at least visibly, at least publicly, is still a minority. So I call ourselves the new minority of India.
Well, my perspective has been that even to a large extent in India, but especially in the U.S., that this far right, this internationalist element, these groups, that they represent, looking, for instance, at the Indian American population and at the percentage of them which are Hindus, that they actually represent a pretty small minority of that population. They just happen to be the most organized, networked, and deep pocketed and loudest group within that population, even though they're the smallest. Certainly, as you mentioned, Hindus for Human Rights or those within your network, or certainly who have whether they're directly connected to the organization or not, have that passion in their hearts, that belief in their hearts. Also, may not be such a large element. Do you think a largest element, whether it's in India or here among the Hindu population, is just a silent passive? That, see, because one of my takes is that whatever the issue is, in India, outside India, anywhere in the world, especially when it comes to issues of human rights or issues of advocacy, that the 99.9% of the population are just everyday people who don't want to have to be bothered to think about this stuff because they're spending too much time trying to live their lives, keep a roof over their heads, put food on their tables, and bring up their children. But do you think that is what represents the bulk of the Hindu population?
Yes, I really do, because when you look at the demographics of India, the kind of population that is in the diaspora probably represent less than 20% of the demographics of India. If you look at so-called Dalits, you look at Adivasis, the indigenous peoples of India, or you look at so-called other backward castes, which is the largest segment of Hindu demographics, they're not represented much in the diaspora. So it's almost like 70% of the Hindu population, or somewhere around that number, are not represented here. So for this minority of Hindus to claim that they're the sole voice of Hindus, they can claim to be the voice of Hindu diaspora. It's fine. That may be statistically correct. But to speak for all Hindus in the world, uh, I I think it is false. It is sad because they simply do not represent the large majority of Hindus. As far as silence in India, yes, as you know, India has, I think, the demographics of the younger population, younger generation, anywhere from 18 to 25, is the largest segment of the India's population. Their primary goal is a career, passing exams, careers, and so forth. They just don't have time to get involved too much in politics, as they think of this as more as politics than as a religious strife. And those of them who are unemployed are directly targets of these hate groups. If you see any image of people being beaten up on the streets of India, you see all those. They're all young men who should be actually at work. They're probably not at work because they don't have a job. So somebody hands them a stick or a sword, they're out there with Bajrang Dal and others beating up Muslims. In fact, I just saw a video where this guy just rides up on a scooter somewhere in Hyderabad, or no, somewhere in Uttar Pradesh, takes out a gun and shoots a father carrying a child because he looks Muslim. And it's just unbelievable to me anyway. So I think that's what it is. It's giving fodder to a large segment of the population who don't have any productive work to get involved in. And that's one of the reasons they also do their best, the rulers, to hide statistics on unemployment, because they don't want to publicly share those types of statistics that people will wake up to.
Well, as we begin to wrap up our conversation, Raju, I did want to ask you one thing about industry human rights, and especially for your personal experience, is as you said, especially when it comes to people actually involved in the organization, it's a smaller number, but growing. And there's a lot of backlash I know that I've seen against industry human rights by a lot of these Hindu nationalist or international sympathetic organizations, and a lot of it could be very vicious. To the extent that I would say basically people are accusing you of being a traitor to your religion, that sort of thing. How do you how does that make you feel? How do you handle that on a personal level and stay strong in the commitment to what you're doing and to your beliefs when you're faced with stuff like that?
Personally, I made a decision before founding Hindus for Human Rights that I will keep out of all social media because I've been trolled even in the 2002, 2004 uh, to the point that they outed my street address and basically asking people to harass me. So I had made a decision to keep. I still don't have a personal Twitter account, for example. I seldom use Facebook. So that's one way of keeping away from the noise, so to speak. But from time to time, other members of Hindus for Human Rights do, you know, copy some of these tweets that they see. So I tend to largely ignore them. However, if somebody takes the trouble of writing to Hindus for Human Rights and say, I strongly object to what you're doing, this is the problem, and they have the courage to put their name at the bottom of the letter, then I feel that I owe them a response. And I try my best to give them a response. And I do ultimately believe that directly engaging with people with different views is the best way ultimately to change the minds of large segments of the Hindu population. And I've invited some of these people for a debate several times. No takers so far, but I will continue on that pathway, saying yes, we will do everything that HFHR is doing to bring attention to the evils of the Hindutva rule, but I'm open to dialoguing with anybody as long as they follow rules of civility. And that's the objective of our Desh Videsh conversations, which we're doing in Silicon Valley,
This
saying,
what
we will present our point of view. It's called the Desh Videsh.
just for our
Uh,
listeners, what does that mean?
Desh Videsh actually means uh, uh, Desh is your country, Videsh is outside your country. So the diasporic Indian population were talking about India and the US at the same time. That dialogue becomes Desh Videsh conversations. And the idea is to present a set of panelists who, with diverse views on a particular subject, but invite Modi supporters, BJP supporters, anybody who wants to come, they can come to these conversations as long as they promise to be civil and not interrupt the speakers. So that's an attempt by HFHR to encourage conversations, and that idea has been reasonably successful. Like the last meeting, I had invited the HAF supporter of the caste bill in California, who had debated with me in front of the Sacramento Capitol. We strongly disagreed with each other, but he was civil. So I said, oh, come on over, participate in this conversation. So that's something I will continue to do. So ignore the trolls, ignore the noise, engage with people who have something to say, even if they strongly criticize you, and then try to put your point of view is what I feel that we need to do. And I think Hindus for Human Rights has a special role, given that the majority community is the one that can change things happening in India.
I oftentimes repeat that in conversations about this issue with people wherever I go, is that of course I'm an outsider and that I'm not even Indian, But I love India. I love the Indian people that welcome me to work on these issues. But for people who want to work on, make progress on the issue of combating Hindu nationalism, in order to make progress, you don't necessarily have to be Hindu, but in order to achieve that final victory, that is going to be left just as it was, for instance, with my own faith, with Christianity, and what's happening today, but certainly has happened in the past. Christians need to be the ones rooting out supremacy from Christianity. Muslims need to be the ones rooting out supremacy from Islam. Hindus need to be the ones rooting out supremacy from Hinduism. And because that's the only way it's going to be effective, otherwise you're never going to actually reach that point of final victory of fully reforming and saving the truth and value of that religion.
Yeah, I agree. You have to speak from within. But I do appreciate, Peter, that your passion for what's happening in India and trying to bring out facts and fearlessly stating your views. And I know you are being personally trolled and attacked ceaselessly, but I do appreciate your role in oftentimes doing things that people from the subcontinent ought to be doing. So thank you for that.
Just a couple last questions, Raju, and I thank you for that. Thank you, sir. One is, as far as the work of H4HR, before I move on to your hopes, dreams, aspirations for the future. With the work of H4HR, I know that the organization does a lot of engagement on the Hill with the U.S. Congress, and yet you've also been in this to one extent or another as an activist for 20 plus years, as we've covered. What I saw back in the early 2000s, certainly 2005 Modi's visa denial might be one example, but there's others of back in the early 2000s, US Congress and the US government in general being much more willing to openly, publicly criticize human rights violations in India, call them out, speak against them, even rather routinely speak against them on the floor of the House, which was done oftentimes by multiple different members throughout the 2000s. And that was a time when the human rights situation was nowhere near what it is today under the Modi government. What do you think is wrong? What do you think has changed from early 2000s to the present day that has shut the mouths of almost all of the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration in general, and brought them to a point of being willing, back when the situation really as a whole wasn't that bad, and yet they were still speaking, to a point when the situation is awful and they refuse to say anything?
I think the short answer is one-word answer: campaign donations, money, that is. I think the fact that the Indian diaspora has become very strong in terms of their financial strength, in terms of making or breaking campaigns, has become a very important issue in the last decade. And they are emulating the pro-Israel groups, and in fact emulating a lot of the Zionist policies. In that sense, I would say they've been fairly successful. I would have never thought what happened in Israel could be copied by people related to such a large country as in India, but in the US, they've just definitely following that. So that's one issue. Secondly, the fact that the Indian American Congress people who are now more visible some of them have been elected with money from the Hindu right. The fact that they are not speaking up against what's happening in Modi's rule, the same people who every day talk about
their presence, these Indian American, or they call it the Samosa Caucus, these Indian American members of Congress, their presence has came long after these early 2000s. I believe the first one elected. Oh, who was it? Was it Ami Bera was the first one elected, I think, in like
Was the first one, but I don't
2010,
remember.
2012.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's happening is when they don't take a lead in critiquing India, and by no means critiquing means you have to condemn the policy of India-US relationship or friendship. They're not mutually exclusive, but they pretend they are mutually exclusive. And if they don't speak up, I think the rest of the Congress people are just holding back, saying, oh, what does Rokanna think about it? Or what does Raja Krishnamurti think about this? Oh, he doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to co-sponsor it. Oh, I'm not going to take a risk. Why should I, go out on a limb? That is we talk about the domino theory. There's something similar to that, where when these four people are creating potentially policies that are larger than themselves, it's not just their constituency that's involved here. They're actually helping maintain a distance from Modi's human rights record. So that's the second part. And the third part is, for better or for worse, the Biden administration and the Secretary Blinken's coming in with this kind of a Cold War politics that containing China, they keep talking about as Modi being the important part. And therefore, they openly admit, we're not going to preach in India about human rights. Now, it's the same president who campaigned constantly talking about human rights and saying silence is complicity. I don't know what has happened. This is the largest example of human rights violations in a democracy. And he refuses to speak about it and says we don't want to preach India. And that's a very sad state of affairs. I think the combination of these things, the three things, clout of the Indian American money, the lead in the wrong direction of our Indian American Congress people that's preventing others from speaking out, and the Cold War type policy of the Blinken administration, which is completely violating its own campaign rhetoric. I think those are the three things, and that's what we are fighting against.
Well, on that note, especially with this whole theory, idea, conception of containing China being what the U.S. is now focused on, which what the U.S. foreign policy wise is focused on, from my perspective, is constantly shifting sands. I remember back when, of course, you could say Cold War policy was containing Russia or the USSR. Then it was containing global terrorism with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the threats against Iran and all of this. Now it's containing China. And from that perspective, speaking for myself as an American citizen, I was been highly critical of U.S. foreign policy on many fronts, not just the India front, but especially on the front of U.S. foreign policy being interventionist and leading to foreign meddling, which I despise. As yourself as someone and myself as someone who wants to see the U.S. doing something different with India, going forward, what do you see? What do you see? What's your hope for the future? What's your realistic expectation? And then in your wildest imaginings, if everything worked out perfectly, and especially in context of the desire that I believe you have, I know I have, for the U.S. to respect India's sovereignty. What do you see? What do you see as a potential in one's wildest imaginations for what the U.S. can and should be doing?
I think simple as conveying to India as an ally and as a staunch friend, conveying that not conveying that disappointment at the Indian government's failure to protect the lives and property of religious minorities and allowing for them to practice their faith unfettered. I think that's a minimal one can expect this government to do.
So minimal would
And
be just talk.
so in my imagination of hope, I hope that something like that will happen, and then it'll energize other people fighting for human rights in India. Um, but outside of the administration, my hope, long-term hope, is that we'll get more and more younger generation of Indian Americans interested in what is happening to look at both the democracies and be more active, and maybe that'll result in a few years' time of more progressive Indian American lawmakers. But more than that, they can have a huge multiplier effect in terms of changing attitudes of the community. And that's the path we are on right now. We just completed our strategy meeting, Hindus for Human Rights, and we are not changing our major priorities in terms of advocacy, but we're adding youth engagement as a major project moving forward, bringing Hindu and Muslim students on campuses, having dialogues, providing a more holistic alternative to youth besides Hinduism, progressive Hinduism. The kids are interested also in, you know, the issue of environment, the issue of gender justice, so indigenous people's rights. Try to provide a kind of a variety of things that the younger generation is interested in, not just about India issue, so that they will become better spokespeople for the Indian American community than the ones we have now. That is my hope, because it's not a short-term issue. Even if the administration doesn't do anything or say anything, we have to keep moving forward in terms of what our role in this community is, in this country is, which is to speak up for democracy all over the world consistently. So that is really my hope.
Well, I appreciate that, especially. I very much agree. I oftentimes come back to this about how all of this political engagement is important. It can be crucial. It can lead to change. But beyond that, far more important, although much more difficult, is this social engagement to really educate people, get people involved, change the hearts of the people around the country and in the society and the religions and the institutions, and that has longer term impact than just this political engagement, as important as that also is. So with that, Raju, any final thoughts?
My only final thought, as India is going through the 77th Independence Day birthday, I never imagined that the country, democracy that was born within a few weeks, or I was born within a few weeks of that democracy being born, would be in jeopardy, and potentially with serious possibilities of demise of that secular democracy would actually precede my own end of my own life. I would have never imagined that. But I hope that before I go, we'll see the Indian democracy again speaking up louder, as we did after Indira Gandhi's emergency, that it'll wake up, learn some lessons from these 8 years of Modi rule, and ensure that we won't be exposed to similar dangers in the future.
Stand there with you in that hope, and I look forward to the day not too far off when Indian democracy will be restored back to what it once was, and even more beyond that, to become flourishing beacon of freedom for the world. And with you, sir, Mr. Raju Rajagopal, being welcomed there and applauded for the role that you played in that future, which we can trust will come. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, please remember to subscribe and follow for more to come as we look forward to dialoguing once again on DOSA.